Hello, thanks again for the opportunity to beam into you all. I'm back here in Washington, D.C. As you'll recall, the last time we had an opportunity for one of these virtual conferences was November. A lot's changed since then, so I'm happy to be able to give you a quick update. First, Canada's out of the blue announcement last week. Our communities, we know, have a pretty unique relationship with Canada's Northern and Western territories. And so our neighbors' decision to close not just the ports, but also its waters to pleasure vessels and cruise ships for the next year by press release, without even a courtesy heads up to anyone in the state, it was truly disappointing, and that's really an understatement to say that. We all know this has devastating impacts to the tourism industry, which of course is a significant economic driver for the region, but also for the whole state. Remember, half of the tourists who visit Denali National Park come up by cruise ship. So believe me, I recognize the significance of this ban to Southeast, and I want you to know that you certainly have my full attention, the attention of all my staff, certainly all of our phone lines, but the whole delegation was working the full weekend on this. To all the residents of Haines and Skagway, and really throughout the region, who were impacted by the storms this past fall, I know that your communities are continuing to assess the damage from really an unprecedented rainfall event. I want to thank the governor and his team for the quick response to your emergency. I was encouraged to see the formal damage assessment that was submitted to FEMA just last week. I also want to acknowledge and thank Mayor Olerud for his leadership. You got a new mayor there, and I just really appreciate his focus and also his concern not just for the physical and safety of health of his community, but for the mental health needs as well. We know that this has been a really hard year, a very taxing year, but there have been so many positive neighbor helping neighbor stories. You hear the stories about the U-Haul trucks being filled with donations from sister communities and then ferried over to Haines. It just warms your heart. So, Mayor, I want to thank you. Also appreciate the Haines Strong sweatshirt that you sent. It's pretty appropriate, and I would extend that to all of you as Southeast Strong. Despite the challenges of this past year, we have to recognize that there are many things to be thankful for. Since I last spoke to you, COVID-19 numbers across the state are continuing to decline. And I'm really proud of the Alaskans who have hunkered down this past year for their friends and families and neighbors, and that our state is now leading the nation in the number of vaccines that are administered per capita. That's great, that's fabulous. And we know that Congress has a role to play in addressing this pandemic, and we have done so with various rounds of funding relief. In December, we passed a bipartisan COVID relief package, which included additional funding for the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. We also heard you loudly and clearly that a priority was to extend the time for state and local governments within which they can spend their COVID relief funds. Also funding to support vaccine distribution and support for our transportation systems, among many, many other important provisions. We included individual economic impact payments of $600 to help Alaskans continue to meet the challenges created by COVID. The bill includes an additional $300 million for fisheries assistance. There's a specific set aside for tribes included within that. I was also able to secure a provision directing the Secretary of Agriculture to provide grant and loan support to seafood processors who have invested heavily to protect their workers. This support is going to be critical for ensuring our seafood processors are able to continue operating and provide a market for our fishermen in 2021. Within the bill, we also provided support for broadband, including $1 billion for tribal broadband connectivity grants. Now, these are available to tribal governments, tribal nonprofits, ANCs, and other Native entities, so this should have a lot of promise for us in Alaska. These grants will expand access to and adoption of broadband service or remote learning, telework, or telehealth resources, which we've all seen are so essential, and particularly during the pandemic. While this federal support is important, I know that all of us would rather be back at work welcoming millions of visitors to our state each year, but allowing people to travel and get back to work get our kids back into schools. It really does depend on continued rollout of the vaccines. And along with that vaccine rollout, know that for purposes of what has happened within the cruise sector, I'm very closely tracking CDC guidance on cruising. I'm working with Customs and Border Protection to ensure that cruise ships can return to our state as soon as it's safe and as soon as our communities are prepared to host them again. We've got so much work to do here. Overcoming the COVID crisis will continue to require a focused, coordinated effort to support communities and facilitate recovery. I'm engaged, deeply engaged, in many of the bipartisan conversations that are going on as we try to advance the solutions that fit the need. Now I want to turn quickly now to the question of lands, resources, and energy in Southeast. First, on the Tongass. As you know, I fought for years alongside colleagues both here in Washington and back home in Alaska to exempt the Tongass from the 2001 roadless rule. And in October of last year, the Trump administration published a new Alaska-specific rule exempting the Tongass from the roadless rule. And you'll remember I was actually able to call into you all at Southeast Conference and announce just that. But unfortunately, the Tongass well-deserved exemption from the roadless rule is currently under review by the Biden administration. It's my hope that they will move forward with it, but I am concerned. I'm almost certain that the rule will be a target for congressional attack under the Congressional Review Act, now that we have both chambers under Democratic control. But you have my firm commitment that I will do everything that I can to ensure the exemption is implemented and remains in place. And I'll remind you all, you know this, but it's worth repeating. Robust environmental protections remain for the Tongass under the roadless exemption. 80% of the forest remains off limits to development, and only 186,000 more acres of the 16.7 million acres in the Tongass were made eligible for timber harvest. All environmental regulations and statutes, including ANILCA, NEPA, the Clean Water Act, the Tongass Timber Reform Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act, all of these still apply. Now, another area that I'm pleased to provide an update on is minerals and mineral security. We all know that this is a critically important issue facing our country today. We're seeing adversaries like Russia and China consolidating their control over international supply chains of minerals that are necessary for the development of high-tech devices, everything ranging from electric vehicles and renewable energy technology to defense technologies. This issue is close to home for many of us, and there are several promising mining proposals in Alaska that seek to develop these resources domestically, thus reducing our vulnerability to foreign supply shocks. And one of these projects is the Bocan-Dotson Ridge project, located just outside of Ketchikan. They're seeking to develop rare earth elements, a category of minerals used in the production of magnets, batteries, electric vehicles, so much more. Ada has weighed in and unanimously passed a resolution authorizing the first step in the construction of a strategic metals complex there in Ketchikan. Domestic mineral extraction and processing can be an important industry to our state and our nation as we seek to manufacture clean energy technologies and other high-tech projects. I was able to accomplish a great deal while I was privileged to chair the Senate Energy Committee. My 6-year tenure as chairman has ended. I'm still on that committee. But I think it is worth noting that one of the significant accomplishments from last year was passage of the American Mineral Security Act, which I'd been working on for a period of time. We included this as part of the Energy Act that was passed at the end of the year. This legislation sets out a framework for the United States to recognize and tackle the challenge of mineral security as the national security threat that it really is. With all the good that was included, though, within that provision, we were not able to secure the modest permitting reforms that I'd proposed. So I'm going to be introducing new legislation in this Congress that will help other mines like Hecla's Greens Creek or Kensington as they seek to continue responsible production. A bipartisan accomplishment that I think should have garnered more attention in the media was an update to our nation's energy policy, the first update in 13 years. The Energy Act, which I had authored with my colleague Senator Manchin from West Virginia, will help commercialize a range of cleaner technologies, giving our local innovators and rural cooperatives an opportunity to test or deploy them. The Energy Act renewed and expanded hydropower incentives. We reauthorized the Weatherization Assistance Program and DOE's Office of Indian Energy. These are both very important to our many Southeast communities. We promoted energy storage, microgrids, and renewable energy, as well as advanced nuclear, all of which could be helpful and important technologies to bring affordable and reliable energy to rural and remote Alaskan communities and around the country. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but I want to turn back to it for a moment, and that's the issue of landslides. The landslides in Haines, unfortunately, claimed 2 lives and significant property loss. As we've seen an alarming rate of natural hazards and record-breaking rainfall across Southeast, this has driven a larger national discussion about preparedness. Most recently, in December, along with Senator Cantwell from Washington, we enacted the National Landslide Preparedness Act to identify and better understand landslides and improve the emergency preparedness and response. Passage of the act is important for Alaska, and I'm hoping that Southeast can be a proving ground to test some new monitoring capabilities. Mapping, of course, is a critically important step in predicting, detecting, and responding to disasters like landslides, earthquakes, and volcanic events. And through my position as chairman of the Interior Environment Appropriations Subcommittee, I've also had the opportunity to provide more funding for mapping in Alaska. Work continues to ensure federal partners cooperate more efficiently in the deployment of monitors and sensors to detect and predict tsunami threats, as well as to ensure that the tsunami warning system is made as robust and helpful as possible. So there's so much that is good and important and pertinent to you in your region. I've gone on longer than I had hoped, and I'm sure that you had hoped, but I want to thank you. I want to thank you for this opportunity to give you some updates, but particularly to thank you for your dedication to support Southeast Alaska. We are all challenged during these times, but I know that working together as we seek to overcome COVID and build a clearer and a more prosperous path to the future, I know doing it together, we are going to get through 22. So I hope to see you all in person in Haines later this year for the annual Southeast Conference. So take care, be well.